Hello and welcome back. In this video, we're going to create a function that allows us to launch our weapon as soon as we drop it. So as soon as we hit the E key to drop the weapon, we'll launch it forward and it'll fly away from us. So it's a little bit more exciting than just falling. So let's get started. Now, first, I'm going to go ahead and drag in a point light into this room because it's awfully dark. And in the details panel, I'm going to increase the light intensity of that quite a bit. And I'm going to hold Alt and drag off to create a couple more of these point lights. So I'm going to select both of these and just duplicate them here. So that way our room is not so dark. Okay, so that looks good. Now we're ready to create some functions for throwing our weapon. Now let's go back into Visual Studio. So we're going to add a couple of functions to our weapon class. So let's go to weapon.h, and here in weapon.h we're actually going to add some stuff. So let's do a public section, and we can actually have a constructor here. So we'll have a weapon. There's our constructor, and let's do a protected section so we can have some protected functions. We'll also have a private section for some private variables and a public section that we can use for some public getters and setters. So for the private section, we're going to add a couple variables. We're going to add an ftimer handle. We're going to call this throw weapon timer. And we'll have a float for the time for when we're throwing the weapon. So throw weapon time. And then we'll also have a bool for when the weapon is falling, and we can call this be falling. So for the protected section, we're going to add a couple functions. We're going to add a function called throw weapon. This will be when we initiate that timer and actually throw the weapon. And we'll also have a function called stop falling, and that'll be for when we want the weapon to stop falling and get back into the pickup state. Now we can create definitions for these. First, we're going to create the aWeapon constructor. So let's go to the weapon.cpp file, and we'll have weapon here. We'll fully qualify its name. So we have our constructor. And we have these float and bool variables, throw weapon time and be falling. So we can go ahead and set these here in the constructor. So I'm going to say throw weapon time and give this a default value of, say, 0.7f. And for be falling, I'm going to give this a default value of false. Now for throw weapon and stop falling, we can go ahead and give these functions definitions. And for throw weapon, we're going to want to apply an impulse to the weapon. So first we're going to want the rotation for our mesh. So let's make an F rotator and call this mesh rotation. And we'll initialize this with 0.f. And for the yaw, we're just going to get our mesh. So we're going to say item mesh and use our get item mesh getter. And from the get item mesh, we're going to call get component rotation and get the yaw from that. So that's going to be the rotation from our mesh. And then for the roll, we're going to set that to 0. And that should initialize this mesh rotation F rotator. So next we're going to set the rotation for our mesh to our mesh rotation, which is basically just getting the yaw component from the mesh and zeroing out the pitch and the roll. So we're going to set the rotation to have basically the pitch and roll zeroed out. So we're going to say get item mesh, and we're going to set world rotation, and we're going to set that to mesh rotation. Now we're going to set B sweep to false. We don't need to sweep. And for the F hit result, we're going to set this to null pointer because it takes a hit result pointer, but we don't need one. We're also going to set the teleport type, so E teleport type to teleport physics. And that way we'll set our rotation so that the pitch and roll are zeroed out. Next, we're going to get our mesh forward vector. So F vector mesh forward, and we'll set this equal to get item mesh, and we're just going to call get forward vector. Now we don't need to change this, so we're going to make it const. And we're also going to create an F vector called mesh right, and we're going to initialize this with get item mesh, and we're just going to call get right vector. And we're going to take the mesh right and rotate it just a bit. So we're going to say mesh right equals mesh right dot rotate angle axis. And we're going to call rotate angle axis to rotate this by -20 degrees. And this is going to take an axis. We're going to rotate this about the forward axis. So mesh forward. So this is giving us a vector pointing in the right vector direction, but we're rotating it down by 20 degrees. You see, this is going to be the direction that we throw the weapon. So let's comment this and say direction in which we throw the weapon. And we'd also like to give this a random rotation. So let's create a float called random rotation. And I'm going to set this to about, say, 30 degrees. And so I'm going to take mesh right, and I'm going to set it equal to mesh right, and I'm going to rotate this again. So let's say rotate angle axis, and this time I'm going to rotate it by random rotation, and I'm going to rotate it about the z-axis. And basically, I zeroed out the pitch and roll, so the z-axis is just the world z-axis. So I can use f vector with 0.f, 0.f, and 1.f, and that's basically a unit vector pointing straight up. So we're first using 30.f for random rotation. We're basically rotating mesh right about the z-axis by 30 degrees, but we can randomize this if we want to. We're just going to see how it looks with 30 for now. Now we're going to take mesh right, and we're going to multiply it by a big number just so that we can see a decent looking impulse. Let's start off with 200,000 or so. So now we have this vector to add an impulse with. So we're going to call get item mesh, and we can use the add impulse function. And that takes a vector. We're going to use mesh right. So really this isn't an appropriate name for this vector. Mesh right sounds like just the right vector. That's pretty appropriate up here, but once we start rotating it and using it to add an impulse, we might just want to call this impulse direction. So up here when we create mesh right, why don't we make this one const? And then here we'll create a new f vector, and instead of calling it mesh right, let's call it impulse direction. That's a bit more descriptive. And impulse direction uses mesh right and mesh forward. So down here, when we're rotating it, we're going to call it impulse direction. And impulse direction times equals 200,000. And then, of course, adding the impulse, we're going to use impulse direction. That makes a bit more sense. Now, once we throw the weapon, we're going to set the B falling boolean equal to true. And we would like to have this boolean equal to true until our timer is done. So we're going to set a timer here. So let's call get world timer manager and set timer. And we're going to use the throw weapon timer. We're going to pass in this, And for our callback function, we're going to say a weapon stop falling. And finally, we need our throw weapon time. Okay. And we'll put those on their own lines there. So finally, in stop falling, we simply need to set be falling to false. Now, the reason we want to know if we're falling is because we're going to want to fix the rotation of our weapon. Because when we throw the weapon, it's going to bounce off the ground and then fall over, but we want it to stay upright. So in weapon, we're going to go ahead and override tick. So here in the public section, let's put virtual void tick, and it takes float delta time, and this is an override. And we can implement this in weapon.cpp up here just under the constructor. We're going to say void a weapon tick float delta time. And here we're going to call super tick, of course, and then we can fix the rotation of our weapon. So why don't we do that? So first we're going to check our weapon's item state. So we're going to say if get item state, and if that's equal to e item state, and we want to see if it's in the falling state, then we can continue. But we also want to check our Boolean be falling, because once be falling changes, then we can handle setting the item state back. So what we're going to do is we're going to get our mesh rotation. So f rotator, mesh rotation. We're going to set this equal to 0.f and get item mesh, get component rotation, and we're going to get the yaw, and then 0.f for the roll. So pitch and roll are zeroed out. And we can make this const as well. And now all we need to do is call get item mesh and set world rotation to mesh rotation. And for sweep, we're going to say false. For hit result, we say null pointer. And e teleport type will be teleport physics, just like we did before. So we'll comment here and say keep the weapon upright. Okay, so for a set period of time, we're going to be keeping the weapon upright. Now all we need to do is call throw weapon from within the shooter character class, which means that throw weapon actually needs to be public, doesn't it? So let's take throw weapon out of the protected section and put it down here in the public section. And we'll give this a comment saying adds an impulse to the weapon. So we can go back to shooter character and drop weapon, and as soon as we set the item state to falling, we can then call equipped weapon throw weapon, and that should give it an impulse. So one of the last things we're going to do is in stop falling, we're also going to set the item state back to pickup. So e item state pickup, and that will go ahead and set all of our collision presets and everything. And our impulse direction, we might want to actually set this down to maybe 20,000 instead of 200,000. But we could tweak that, and if we wanted to, we could make it a parameter. Now, before we compile this and test it out, we're going to add a single line up here in our constructor, and that's going to be this line, primary actor tick dot beCanEver tick equals true. Now, if you ever find that your tick function isn't being called, make sure you have this in your constructor, because an actor will not tick if this is set to false. Let's go ahead and compile and test this out in the editor. And we'll hit play. And there we have it. We're throwing the weapon down, and it's staying relatively upright. It's actually kind of at the same pitch and roll that it had in our character's hands. But you can see now we're actually able to pull up the pickup widget because it's now in the pickup state. So it was in the equipped state in our hands. Now that we've thrown it down, it's in the pickup state. So let's go ahead and see that one more time. There we have it, and it's now in the pickup state. So perfect. So that's going to conclude this video. Now, in the next video, we're going to implement swapping behavior. So what we're going to want to do is be able to walk up to a weapon and pick it up and equip it and then drop our equipped weapon. So basically swapping our current weapon for a weapon that is in the world. So we'll implement that in the next video. We'll see you soon.